our system today is the respiratory, and so there's some overlap here with excretory system. Also, there's some overlap with the circulatory system. So we'll talk about some of those things. But in terms of our respiratory system, includes our lungs and diaphragm and bronchi and trachea. The purpose of our respiratory system is twofold. First, it is to take in oxygen and oxygenate our blood. That oxygen will later on be used in our cells for cellular respiration. But there's also an excretory function of the lungs, and that is to remove carbon dioxide from our blood. So our respiratory system is tightly linked with our circulatory system. Neither one can function on its own. Our respiratory system wouldn't be able to function and get oxygen to our cells if it weren't for our circulatory system. At the same time, our circulatory system, the blood cells would not be oxygenated if not for the respiratory system. So they're both connected there.
Are we getting our test back?
Yeah. People still have to take it. So to breathe in and out, to inflate and deflate our lungs, we use a muscle that is stretched on the bottom of our rib cage. It's kind of tucked up here in our rib cage. It's kind of like a parachute, sealed tightly. And our diaphragm is this muscle which when we contract it, it sort of contracts and creates low pressure in our chest cavity. And therefore, air goes into our lungs to equalize that pressure. And that's how we breathe in. When we relax the diaphragm, that's how we exhale. So contracting allows us to breathe in, relaxing allows us to exhale. And so our diaphragm sometimes has a spasm, like any muscle in your, you can get a muscle spasm.
Oh, I have that.
And a diaphragm spasm is just what we call a hiccup. When you hiccup, you have a sudden contraction of your diaphragm, which is really just like a muscle spasm. Sometimes, if you fall, if you get hit, you might have your diaphragm temporarily sort of stunned and kind of paralyzed for a few seconds. What do you call that? Yeah, getting the wind knocked out of you. When you get the wind knocked out of you, your diaphragm for a minute is not contracting or relaxing, you can't breathe. It doesn't last very long, it's really scary when it does happen because you feel like you're never going to be able to breathe. But it really only lasts a few seconds typically, and then you're usually able to breathe after that.
Last year, I was wearing socks when I was walking down the stairs, like before I went to school.
Yeah.
And I slipped and I fell, and I went down the edge of one of my stairs, like hung over from that to one part, went underneath my rib cage and hit my lungs, and I couldn't breathe for like 25 seconds. My dad had to like lift me up, and I had to go to like the doctor because my ribs shifted over my lungs. I couldn't go to school for like 2 days.
Yeah, that's scary when that happens. So the shape of the diaphragm is kind of interesting. It's this like sort of umbrella shape, and it's tucked up underneath your rib cage.
Mr. Brewer! Guys, I'm glad you're...
So, breathing.
Wait.
Why do we have this ugly guy outside?
What's that?
Who's this?
This Mr. Arcare put these pictures in there. So, we call this the respiratory system, but it's a little bit confusing how we use these terms. Because we already talked about respiration, but we were talking about cellular respiration, when glucose and oxygen are used to release ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. That is called cellular respiration. What we're talking about really should be called breathing, or sometimes called external respiration. But breathing is the process of getting air out of our lungs, and then that oxygen is absorbed into our blood. In our actual cells, that oxygen is used to release energy. And carbon dioxide is produced. So they're related, but they're not the same thing. So as we breathe in and out, the general atmosphere around us is about 78% nitrogen, actually. Most of the air is the gas nitrogen. We can't use it when we breathe in. So we breathe in, and it's mostly nitrogen, 78%. When we exhale, our exhaled air is also about 78% nitrogen. So we're not taking in or releasing any. Oxygen, however, the air around us has about 21% oxygen. As we inhale that air into our lungs, some of it diffuses into our red blood cells. The air that we exhale has about 17% oxygen. So there's still plenty in the air that we exhale, there's still plenty of oxygen in it. In fact, that's why you could breathe into a container and rebreathe that air and still get oxygen out of it. As far as carbon dioxide, this is actually a little bit high. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is less than 1%. Well, we're just rounding here. The air that we exhale is about 5% carbon dioxide. So you could see in the air compared to before, after we take it in, we're taking oxygen out of it, adding carbon dioxide to that air. Yeah, there you put a picture of me. Well, maybe we'll come back, maybe we won't. So as we inhale, so our respiratory system, obviously we can inhale through our nose or through our mouth. They connect in the back of our throat. Like if you were choking on a piece of food, why don't you just breathe through your nose?
Because you're not that smart.
Because it wouldn't work either. Okay, where the food has been lodged is after, okay, the air passage from your nose and your mouth merge. So you still wouldn't be able to breathe through your nose even if you're choking on a piece of food. So is it healthier to breathe through your mouth or your nose?
Your mouth. Your nose. Your nose.
Yeah, it is. Generally, we your nose, for a couple reasons. Your nose has lots of hairs. Some of us, Mr. Harry, more than others. But those hairs inside of your nose, they have a purpose. Okay? The purpose is they help to filter out impurities in the air, allergens, bacteria, dust. Your nose hairs and mucus in your nose, snot, boogers, also do the same thing. They help to filter out little bits of stuff in the air, so the air that actually gets into our lungs is a little purer. It helps warm the air a little bit. It's sort of a longer pathway. The air gets a little bit warmer. So you could see here, the trachea is then the tube that connects to our nasal and our pharynx. So the trachea is, sometimes it's called your windpipe. Goes down the front of your neck. It's reinforced with rings of cartilage, because obviously it's really important that your trachea stays open.
I think
If your trachea closes, yeah, you can have like trauma to the trachea that can damage it, that can cause it to collapse, and you can't breathe. That's dangerous. And so the trachea is the main passageway into our lungs. Just this tube that goes down through our neck into our chest. It's reinforced by these rings of cartilage. And as it gets down around our sternum, it branches into two sides. The two sides are called the bronchi. The two big branches off of the trachea are the bronchi. And then those two bronchi start to branch into smaller passageways, which branch into smaller passageways and so forth to make up our lungs. Those smaller branches are called the bronchioles. and eventually as these pathways get smaller and smaller, they eventually end in a little cluster, looks like clusters of grapes almost, little air sacs that are called alveoli. So this is the end of the bronchioli, and this is where the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide actually takes place. So once the air gets to the end of this long passageway, it inflates these little air sacs, these alveoli, and then oxygen can diffuse into our blood, and carbon dioxide from our blood can diffuse into this airspace so that we can then exhale.
What is your Adam's apple?
It's just a part of your voice box, sort of. It's more pronounced in some people than others. So when we look at our alveoli, so this is again from the body's exhibit, our lungs are not hollow sort of balloons that kind of inflate and deflate. Sometimes people have that concept of our lungs. It's like a plastic bag as you breathe in and it opens up. It's actually all these clusters of tiny little air sacs, and they inflate when we breathe in and out. So this is kind of what they would look like. So basically our whole lung is made of just many of these clusters of air sacs. And as the air comes in that we inhale, our blood vessels, we have capillaries that surround these alveoli. That's what you see here. There's a capillary network. And so as this air sac gets filled in with air, some of the oxygen then can diffuse into the red blood cells. At the same time, we know from our circulatory section, the blood that's getting here is higher in carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide can diffuse out of our blood and into this airspace so we can exhale it. And this happens by diffusion. Remember, there's high to low concentration is how molecules diffuse. So when the blood gets here, there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the alveoli, so it goes to a lower concentration in the red blood cell. And the opposite is happening with carbon dioxide.
Are they actually like red, or is that just because the capillary?
The blood cells?
Or what?
Oh, no, this? No, they've been stained, I would guess. Yeah,
What color are they actually?
Probably they don't really have much color, I would guess.
Just like-
Just like flesh color or something grayish.
Kind of like that.
I mean, it might be a darker color.
Not one bit.
So when we swallow, obviously, it's important that food doesn't go into our trachea. If it does, that's what it means to choke.
Oh,
So-
it goes down the wrong pipe.
Yeah, well, sort of. So our trachea has at the top this little flap called the epiglottis. When we swallow, this epiglottis closes, it covers our trachea, so whatever we're swallowing doesn't go down our trachea, and instead goes down our esophagus. When we're breathing, our epiglottis opens so that we can get air into our lungs. So you generally stays open. If you happen to sort of inhale while you have something in your mouth, a piece of food can go and get lodged in the trachea. And if it blocks the flow of air, that's dangerous. Typically, what is our body's response when something gets into our trachea?
Cough.
Yeah, coughing. So if you ever like took a sip of water and like then you start coughing, then it may have gone into your trachea, and you're then gonna cough and try to expel that. If you get a piece of food, same thing. You cough, you'll typically expel whatever got into your trachea. And that's also why, if you've ever taken any first aid or if you've learned in health class, if a person looks like they're choking, however they're coughing, or they can still talk, that means air is still going through their trachea. And so they'll eventually probably cough out whatever's blocking it. If a person inhaled something and was not able to cough or talk, that's when they need help and need to have, a Heimlich maneuver or back blows done to help expel that. So the epiglottis is why we typically don't choke.
Where's the echolobus?
It's right here. It's hard. It's not a great animation, but you can see as the food goes down this top of the trachea. It's covered. All right, some lung diseases, disorders, so forth. So obviously smoking cigarettes is bad for your lungs. The vast majority of lung cancers can be linked to smoking, about 87%. So smoking, basically you have combustible materials being inhaled into the lungs. And so that leads to sort of the buildup of things like tar that's in cigarettes into the lungs. It leads to greater incidence of heart disease, stroke, asthma, and so forth. And so here you see a comparison of healthy lungs versus the lungs of a smoker. And again, the more a person smokes, the higher their risk of lung cancer gets. So if a person smoked in the past but then quit, okay, then their risk starts to decrease after they quit. If they continue smoking, they smoke a lot, then their risk factors increase. So there's a high correlation between smoking and lung cancer, as well as these other diseases. And so obviously people have in the past, and you know that when I was growing up, a lot of people smoked cigarettes. You know, I would say, I don't know the percentage of what it was, but pretty high. Like my grandparents smoked, my father smoked, and nowadays, so smoking cigarettes become far less common in the United States, at least. You know, if I think about my friends, I don't have a single friend that smokes now. If this was the late 70s or 80s, probably half of my friends would be smokers. So that's good news. And it was a long time before people really accepted the link between smoking and lung cancer. And for a long time, cigarette companies fought against the research that showed that smoking was really bad for one's health. And so since then, people are much more educated, and the rate of smoking has dropped drastically. However, the incidence of things like vaping and e-cigs and Juul, that sort of thing, has become more and more common. So that's a relatively new. What's the origin of e-cigs? Anybody know? What's their original intent? Abby?
Well, I'm pretty sure that they were meant to help smokers slowly get off of it.
Yeah, so they're originally intended as a way to help people quit smoking. So so smoking is addictive, so especially nicotine. So nicotine, a chemical that's in cigarettes, is addicting. And so people have a really, really hard time to quit smoking. And so there's lots of ways people try to quit. And you know, sometimes they have nicotine gum. There's nicotine patches, which continue to give a person the nicotine that they're addicted to, but without giving them as many of the toxins that were in cigarette smoke. So e-cigs were meant originally to help people to quit smoking. Okay? And since then, however, they've sort of taken on the same sort of role that smoking cigarettes has taken. Now, lots of people vape or use e-cigs sort of almost as if they were smoking cigarettes. Okay? So these are relatively new, however, and so that the long-term risks of e-cigs and so forth are not so super clear. So there's been some research that suggests they lead to higher incidence of bronchitis and some other illnesses. The other issue is that they become, so some of the makers of these products, especially like Juul's, come under a lot of pressure because people felt like they market them to kids, that they have flavors that make them attractive to kids, and so they've sort of taken on that role. And there's some places are urging for legislation that they take away some of those things that make these more enticing for kids, because now people not are addicted to e-cigs and Juul and things like that. which the effects of that is not known, but they certainly aren't healthy.
So my grandpa was born in 1949. When he was like 6 or 7, like he has had like not heart problems with like bad stuff, but like just
Yeah.
heart issues throughout his whole life. And whenever like he was like 6 or 7, he was in the hospital getting like tests done, and it like took like a couple days because like technology wasn't as good back then. And his parents like they came in one day and they gave him like a carton of cigarettes just because like
That's how things used to be.
because they didn't know like that was like the how it was, and he was only like 7.
Yeah, it's definitely things have changed in terms of smoking cigarettes.
Things stopped with that as well.
Yeah, when I was a kid, we used to have like candy cigarettes and stuff, and we'd spend the smoke. My grandparents, my father always smoked in the car when we were, so things were just things were different then, but people have learned better. Asthma. So asthma is a lung disease that affects a lot of people. It's fairly common. And what asthma is, so normally our airways into our bronchioles are sort of wide open and leading into the alveoli. Air can get in, just fine. However, sometimes when a person has asthma, the walls of those bronchioles can swell up, narrowing the pathway and making it more difficult to breathe, making it more difficult to get air into the lungs. And if a person has an asthma attack, there's also these smooth muscle bands that are around the bronchioles. And in an asthma attack, they start to constrict. So not only is the passageway narrow, but during the asthma attack, these rings of smooth muscle tighten, make it even more difficult for a person to get air into their lungs. So probably lots of you know people that have an asthma inhaler. Sometimes people take an inhaler every day to help manage it sort of long term, but also there are rescue inhalers that a person takes when they feel like the onset of an asthma attack. Do you know what the name of those medicines are called?
Airboys.
They're called, those types of medicine are called bronchodilators.
That's what I
Oh, yeah, it's pronounced right.
And so what that means is a dilate means to open, and bronchi, meaning those airways, these bronchodilators help to relax these muscles and open up the airways during asthma attacks.
When you breathe in, are like do the top bronchioles get like filled all the way first, and then like the bottom ones don't, or is it like an even dispersion?
Well, it is. So some of the top ones do fill first. In fact, when a person has pneumonia or some other lung disease, what doctors try to encourage them to do is breathe in as deeply as possible, because if you breathe very shallowly all the time, then you're not really inflating those lower down alveoli, and they can sort of stretch out or not be as healthy as the other ones. Or if you have fluid building up in these alveoli, which happens in pneumonia and other diseases, then you're not able to expel that fluid as well. So they encourage you to do very deep breathing sometimes in those cases. So we have phlegm, mucus, inside of our
That's how
lungs
it's
and in the
spelled?
bronchi and so forth. And it's there for a purpose. It's there to help filter out any pathogens, things like that. However, sometimes if we have some lung infection, if you have bronchitis, if you have a cold or something, then you might be coughing up a lot of that phlegm because it's doing its job. It's capturing these pathogens. It has white blood cells in it. And that's why it gets thicker and its color changes when you're sick, because it's helping to remove those things from your body.
I didn't know if it was spelled like that. That's gross.
Yeah. So pneumonia and bronchitis are infections of the bronchi and of the lungs. And if bacteria get into our lungs, into our bronchi, they can start an infection. Our body will try and fight it off by creating those white blood cells, by helping to clear it out. But sometimes we need help, and antibiotics and so forth can help to clear that infection. And obviously, as fluid builds up in those alveoli, they're unable to do their job. They're unable to take in oxygen to get rid of carbon dioxide.
Sure, you just sleeping? Yeah.
All right.
How?
Any questions about the respiratory system? I guess we're going to go on here.
Oh.
All right, our last system. So the quiz won't be on reproductive system. The quiz will be on up to respiratory system. So our final system is the reproductive system, male-female reproductive system in humans. So obviously the purpose of the reproductive systems are to create new organisms, to create more humans, since we are talking about humans. So we'll start off talking about the male reproductive system. And so what body system did we already mention the testes in?
Endocrine.
Endocrine system, because the testes produce what?
Testosterone.
Testosterone, yes, the male sex hormone. But testes also produce sperm cells. That's their other function. That's a reproductive function. And so the hormone testosterone is responsible for the development of secondary male sex characteristics, things like facial hair, body hair, a deeper voice, increased muscle mass. This is why some people, adults, administer themselves testosterone. And what do we call that?
Steroids.
Yeah, steroids. So by a person giving themselves injections or creams of testosterone, it can cause their body to develop unnaturally large levels of muscle mass. So when you see sort of bodybuilding competitions where people have just enormous muscles, oftentimes it's because they've been using testosterone to develop that muscle tone. But you also maybe have heard of that when a person is taking testosterone supplements or injecting testosterone, also leads to changes in behavior, more aggressiveness, roid rage, if you ever heard that term. And again, that's a real thing because testosterone is not only responsible for these physical characteristics, but also aggression and anger.
In like bodybuilding competitions, you're allowed to use testosterone?
No, typically not. So there's a couple things. Good question. So even some like if you see posters for bodybuilding competitions, sometimes they say natural, and they mean that the contestants have not taken testosterone or certain other substances. And so there are some competitions like that. There are other competitions where there's not testing, or there are ways of giving a person testosterone that are undetectable. So there's sort of a lot of ways around those things. But no, it's not legal. It's illegal to take testosterone for the purpose of just bodybuilding and so forth. So when we talk about reproduction, there's a term gamete. Gamete is a general term for a specialized cell, a reproductive cell. Okay? Sometimes called a sex cell. And the male gamete is called a sperm cell. And sperm cells are made in the testes, and they're constantly produced. This is what a sperm cell sort of looks like. So in the head of the sperm is where the chromosomes are located, the part that carries the actual genetic material. Behind the head of the sperm cell, there's like a little motor. And what do you think this is called?
The flagellum.
It's a flagellum. It's
cool.
like the euglena had a flagellum. Sperm cells have a flagellum because I count. They have a long journey to make. So sperm cells need to make their way to the egg cell in order to fertilize it, and so to get there, they need to swim. And so they have that flagellum for that purpose. So in some organisms, the testes are internal. inside of the male body. In humans and in lots of other mammals, testes are actually held slightly outside of the body. And in males, they're held in the scrotum, pouch of skin, sort of that holds the testes outside of the body. And there's a reason for that. Anybody have an idea why testes have to be outside of the body a little bit?
Because sperm is destroyed unless maintained at 97 degrees
I
Fahrenheit.
didn't realize you had that. Yeah,
Let's go.
it's to
So
keep them
small.
slightly cooler. The optimal temperature for the production of sperm cells is actually a little bit cooler than body temperature. So a little bit cooler than 98.6. And so by keeping the testes outside of the body in this pouch of skin, they can be held at around 97 degrees. That is the optimum temperature for sperm to be produced. So sperm are produced in the testes, and testes and testicles, that's the same thing. Just use different words, can be used interchangeably. So the sperm are actually produced in the testes, and then they go to this part. You don't have to know this, but this is called the epididymis. Those sperm cells then mature. So when they're first produced, they're immature. They go to this epididymis to mature, and then when they're going to be released from the body, they travel along this tube. But they don't travel along that tube just as sperm cells. Along the way, different materials are added to the sperm. And that mixture of the sperm cells and these other fluids is called semen. And the semen's purpose is to protect the sperm cells, to give them nutrients for them to make their journey, to maintain the proper pH, so that the sperm cells can eventually fertilize the eggs. This is what sperm cells actually look like under the microscope. You can see the lighter portion is the head of the sperm, then you can see the flagellum, and you can see the little sort of cellular motor that's behind the head of the sperm cell. I guess, yeah, we can do this. All right, so are these reproductive organs, or are they part of another system we've talked about?
Another system.
They are part of another system. What system?
The big boys.
Excretory system.
That's what I said.
So we're talking about them here because they're in the same vicinity, and one of these is in common with the reproductive and excretory system. So here in the diagram, it's sort of not shown where this leads. That's the ureter. And as we learned in excretory, it takes that drip of urine from the kidneys down into the urinary bladder, which is here, which stores the urine. The part that's in common is the last part. So this is the urethra, and it carries urine out of the bladder, but it also carries the semen out of the body. So it has both a reproductive and an excretory function. We'll stop here because we're going to run out of time here before we get to the next slide. But we'll talk about the other parts of the male reproductive system tomorrow after we work on a little bit of review.